I am going to start really at the top, but that's about as much as we'll do. And we'll cover some of the rest of the stuff that you can't read in the breakout session. But the questions that arose immediately to talk about interspiritual, spiritual direction is what is spiritual direction, what is not spiritual direction, what makes spiritual direction interspiritual, what's the focus of interspiritual direction, and you'll see there's a little thing that says you do not have to be good. I'm going to end with that. And then what's the process? So it's a big topic. We're going to talk about a tiny bit, and then my hope is that your questions will bring out a lot more of it. Where I do want to start is this place up here where it says what is not spiritual direction. I'm not going to explain this, I'm just going to say, we can talk about it later, spiritual direction is not spiritual formation. It's not trying to make somebody into something that they're not yet. It's not counseling or therapy, it's not coaching, and it's not pastoral counseling. And hopefully during this talk you'll get a little taste of what it is. To start though, I want to start with this quote from Wayne Teasdale, which I just love. Each of us is called to be a mystic. To be a human being means that we're invited into the possibility of transcendental life and experience. We're not here simply to pursue a profane existence spent plotting the course of our human happiness. We're meant for greater things. The call into life is a call into being. It's a summons into the deific possibility for us, an opportunity to actualize our potentiality, to realize higher levels of consciousness, and that's from the mystic heart. And Wayne Teasdale is one of my heroes, and I love him and the work, and so I wanted to share this because my sense is that spiritual direction, if we give a very brief definition of it, spiritual direction is the holding of the space for people who have found their yes to this to pursue it. That's really what's going on in spiritual direction. It is the place where people can follow their call to the something more of life. It comes out of a tradition, actually, at least the one that I'm trained in. I would say that it's, now the screen is taking my words, and it's actually off the thing. Anyway, this has many branches over here. Spiritual companion, spiritual guidance, spiritual mentoring, spiritual friendship, soul friending. These are all words that you'll find used for spiritual direction. The term spiritual direction is a bit unfortunate because it implies that this person that you go to, the spiritual director, is going to direct you, and it's actually the opposite of that. It's actually that the spiritual director is going to hold the space for you to listen to the guidance that's arising in the direction of your life. So if you go to a spiritual director who says this is what you need to do in your search for God, you should go and find yourself another spiritual director, because that is not appropriate spiritual direction. There are spiritual directors who are more active. There are spiritual directors who might give you suggestions, but if a spiritual director that says this is what you should do is not doing, in my opinion, ethical spiritual direction. So it's an unfortunate term. Anyway, there's one root to this, and it's in the tradition that I'm trained in, which comes out of the Christian contemplative tradition. It's desert spirituality. A few hundreds, thousands years ago, there were some folks, 3rd and 4th century, that decided that the city was too crazy for them, and that the church was losing its spiritual connection. So they left the churches and they left the cities, really impelled, following the longing of their heart. Or I have this little hand up here, or was it that they were pushed? You know, is it a longing or is it a pushing? And sometimes we can't really be sure. But they followed it, whatever it was, and went out into the deserts where they were seeking to follow the imperative, the scriptural imperative that says, be still and know that I am God. And so they took up a life of quiet study and prayer and contemplation. And solitude they thought, but not for long, because people have a nose for the fragrance of wisdom. And so folks started following them out into the desert and making these pilgrimages to go and see the desert Ammas and fathers. And they would show up and say, Father, give me a word. Mother, Amma, give me a word. And wait for the word. And sometimes it was only a word, and sometimes it was 8 words. And these words are collected in the teachings of the desert mothers and fathers. But such was born the tradition of spiritual direction within the Christian contemplative framework. From the perspective of the perennial wisdom, I would say this. The perennial wisdom tells us that across every tradition, there really are only 2 fundamental questions. The first is, how do we know the difference? How do we discern the difference between the real and the unreal? Or the real, capital R real, and the less real. So which is the direction of the real and where's everything else is somewhere else. And then the second focus, and across traditions is, and once I've discerned what is real, how do I align my life and live from that place? So from my point of view, interspiritual, spiritual direction, doesn't matter what tradition somebody's coming with, and I work with people in multiple traditions, no tradition. These are the same fundamental questions that we hold together. How do I know the difference between the real and the unreal, the ego, the other voices, culture, all of those things? How do I hear that voice? And once I hear it, how do I live my life that way? That's spiritual guidance questions. Today gave me such a beautiful example of a question for spiritual guidance, spiritual direction. When Matthew Wright did his beautiful, was that like a crazy, gorgeous presentation that Matthew did? I mean, so all about the heart, totally. And somebody said, what do you do, but what do I do about the fear? And Matthew answered it as a question that was asking about how do I meet other people when they meet me with fear about this, which was, and he gave a gorgeous answer. But the spiritual director in me heard another question. And the spiritual director in me heard, what do I do with my fear? Because I get that this is a way, but this is really scary stuff for me. That's the spiritual direction question. And that's the kind of place that a spiritual director sits with someone. And we don't try to solve it. And there's the difference. There's no solving that question, what do I do with the fear? There's a listening to the question. There's a deepening into the question. There's hearing the roots of the question. There's space for time to unfold the question. But there is not, from the spiritual director, oh, this is what you do with your fear. And again, I would say if that's what happens in spiritual direction, you should find another spiritual director. You know? Now, it's not to say that there are places to ask the question and be met that way. If you're doing therapy, and it's like, I'm paralyzed by this fear, there's going to be a whole different response to it. And it's fine, beautiful, but it's not necessarily spiritual direction. So, the purpose, that's over there, of spiritual direction, is really this. It's helping people to live into their answers to the great questions that arise throughout human history. And to do that, we have to be so patient because we don't get answers to those questions from anybody else. So I love this Rilke poem. I think it's the best poem about this. I use a ton of poetry in my spiritual direction. Sometimes we sit in silence, we listen, and what arises in the silence will be a Rumi poem or a Rilke poem or some other image like that that helps guide. So in terms of the purpose of this and helping people, the Rilke poem, I want to beg you as much as I can to be patient with all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. So try to live with the questions now, and someday, at some point perhaps, far away in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. So again, spiritual direction is not about providing the answer. It's about helping somebody stay there, helping somebody stay in the don't know long enough, because it's anxiety producing. We don't want to be in don't know. We want to get out of don't know as quickly as we can, because after all, in our culture, we're supposed to know. So to help somebody sit in don't know is a radical act for us, to stay there and to trust that out of not knowing will arise truth. And then the next radical act is, can I actually trust what arises from me? And that is a way huger problem than I actually realized until quite recently, about how embedded it is, not the deep mistrust of our own interior wisdom. So I want to tell you a story that comes out of the practice, just because it's really a fun one, and because it illustrates a little bit about what is spiritual guidance. At the end of a spiritual guidance session a few months ago, I gave time for silence, which I always do, and we listen. And my way of saying it is, let's give Spirit the last word. So let's take some quiet to give Spirit the last word, see what arises. So after that silence, the person on the phone, and I have her permission to share this with you, said to me, well, I'm not getting anything. It's just nothing. I said, oh, well, no, nothing's fine. And she said, well, it's just weird. I mean, I'm just getting this image of the ruby slippers. And I was like, oh, well, tell me what's happening. She said, well, it's just the ruby slippers, and then I'm singing Glinda, and I'm, Dorothy, and then I'm just here, like, there's no place like home, there's no place like home. She says, it makes absolutely no sense. And so I'm not getting anything. And I just started laughing. I was like, you think this is nothing? You think you're getting nothing? I said, what did we just spend the entire session talking about? And I just love this. We had been speaking about how her life is really full, many wonderful things happening. She's running like an Ironman. She's like 55 years old. She blows my mind. And she said, but I feel like I stopped doing my practices in the morning because I've been doing my training for the Ironman, and so I've been feeling like I'm not really, I haven't been attending. And she said, and I got this image, I forgot this, at the beginning of our session, but I didn't even say it because it seemed so ridiculous. And so I said, for Dorothy, there's no place like home was about a farm in Kansas. For you, that's not what this means. For you, there's no place like home is about your home. And your home is not a farm in Kansas. Your home is your own heart. It's your radiant, beautiful heart, and you have found yourself a bit displaced. You found yourself a bit away from home, caught up in Oz and in the excitements. And so this is affirmation of everything we just talked about. This is a gift that says, yes, you understand there is no place like home, because she had come to, I really want to pick up my practice again. This is important to me. So here's the confirmation from Spirit. Who could have imagined this? And if we had approached this as a problem to solve, how could such an image have arisen? So part of the spiritual direction is a willingness to trust yourself enough, and the person enough, and Spirit enough that the right things will arise. Because here's the truth. I love how this is the theme of this conference. We heard it from Desmond Tutu last night, talking about the heart, and this is about the heart. This is the purpose of spiritual direction, is coming back to the heart that is always good, always true, always beautiful, is always there, always has been, always will be. And so this brings me back to how I wanted to start. So here's the thing. And I hope I can say this in a way that really communicates the experience of it in a way that doesn't seem like it contradicts something else. Anyway, what I have found is I have to emphasize this a lot to people in spiritual guidance. Because the people that I have in spiritual guidance, the people that seek spiritual guidance, fundamentally are already people, if we want to say converted, good people. The people that are not good people are not seeking out spiritual guidance. So this is the first principle of discernment according to Ignatius. Ignatius, this brilliant teacher of discernment, says, look, there's two groups of people. There's people that are already on the path, and there's people that are not on the path. And your spiritual guidance for people that are already on the path is a totally different process than your spiritual guidance for people not on the path. So people that are in spiritual direction, by and large, pretty much on the path, are trying to be good people. But deeply embedded in that is a fundamental distrust of their own humanity and their own basic goodness, is what I'm discovering over and over again. And what I've come to start to really think deeply about, and some of you I'm sure will disagree with me, I hope so, but it's my observation that increasingly the harm that's done in the world, probably most of the harm that's been done in the world, has been done by people who are trying to be good, who have discerned that they know the way, who have discerned that they are the chosen people, who have discerned that theirs is better than yours, and that yours threatens theirs, and so they are trying to be good. And so I've really been trying to feel into this place, this edge between we long to be of service, sacred activism, serving humanity, and then this whole shadow about trying to be good and the mold that we get kind of pushed into in trying to be good. So I want to share a poem with you, and this is Mary Oliver. This is actually the first line of Mary Oliver poem. And many of you know this poem. You might hear it a whole different way now, I don't know. But I want you for you to notice what happens in your body, mind, spirit. Even when you first saw these words, you do not have to be good. I'd like you to even just check in and notice what happens when you do not have to be good. And notice all the stuff that comes up. So notice again. And again. So she says, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees across the desert for 100 miles, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. You do not have to be good. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me of despair yours, and I'll tell you mine. Meanwhile, life goes on. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue mountain air, are heading home again. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. Calls out to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over calling out, announcing your place in the family of things. So I could ask you, well, what does this got to do with spiritual direction? InterSpiritual, spiritual direction, and it's this. This is my take on it. I would say the purpose of spiritual direction and guidance is not to make us good or holy or acceptable in the eyes of God or anybody else for that matter. The purpose of spiritual direction is not to redeem us from our fundamental brokenness or our original sinfulness. It's not to make us worthy of love, God's love or anybody else's love. It is not to form us into the perfect spiritual person, InterSpiritual or otherwise. Spiritual direction is actually the opposite of formation, because formation assumes a goal and it assumes a way something's, and spiritual direction is a total hands-off allowance. So the purpose of InterSpiritual, spiritual direction is to support us in becoming a true self, in becoming a true human being. In Islam we would say the insan kamil, the true perfection of the human being, and there's only one of that in each here. So the purpose of spiritual direction and guidance is to help people unfold the principles of the perennial wisdom into a living experience rather than a concept, into a real knowing and gnosis that replaces all our mental constructs or ideas. Now here's how, for me, this comes back around to, but then how do we, if you're saying, well, we don't have to be good, then aren't the principles that we're supposed to be doing our compassionate action and our service, and what do we do, become slugs? And my answer to you is, if you think that, that is the voice of the conditioned ego who believes in separation and who doesn't believe that if assisted to finding the truth of who we are, if assisted in coming into the actual reality of what this is, this heart, if what we have to learn to do is to trust that when that happens, the only response we will have is love. The only response we can have is the longing, deeper than any longing, to give it back, to pour it back out into the world, to use it in service. But when we come at our service, out of the story that I want to be a holy, good, spiritual person, and I'm going to help, that will always be contaminated with the separate self, which is not necessarily good. So it's a paradox. We don't have to be good. If we can find the ways to bring forth what is true, we will always bring forth what is good and what is beautiful. And this I see as the sacred work of the spiritual guide, who can sit with somebody in the dark sometimes, waiting and watching for the flicker and the flame, and most importantly, holding the space for that person who's in the dark so that they can have the courage to sit there long enough until the truth of what's trying to emerge emerges. And that is a delicate skill, and it's one of the capacities of the spiritual guide, is the capacity to dwell in unknowing without getting anxious about it, but being able to be the holding space. You are not in this alone. I am with you. I've had people, I can remember one person just suddenly this came into my head and she said, I no longer have hope. I don't know who God is, and I don't have any hope. And what can I do? Am I going to try and talk her out of that? And so I sat with her and I said, I will hold your hope here until you can take that back again for yourself. I'll hold it for you. And so let's sit, let's feel that place that you're in. So that is really the briefest overview. I wanted to try and give you a feeling for how it goes, what it's about. And I hope I've done that. I want to leave it, the last words to Rumi. And Rumi's words are not more advice. Not what Rumi said. Rumi actually said, no more advice. The first line. Some of you know this poem. No more advice. He says, let yourself be silently drawn by the stronger pull of what you really love. And this, I think, is profound advice for the spiritual director and for those of us that are seeking to come home to the heart that is peace and goodness and beauty. So I thank you and welcome your questions, and I look forward to dialogue and breakout. And I'm on time. Yes!